Our second topic for Chapter 7 will look at different approaches to parenting. And we will get to enjoy pictures of me and my mom and me and my dad as a teenager throughout the video. I want to start by going over different parenting styles. We know that every individual parent has their own unique approach to parenting. But most of those different styles can be broken down into two broad domains: demandingness, or the number of rules and expectations a parent has for their child, and responsiveness, or how sensitive a parent is to the child's needs and how willingly and often they express love through hugging, through saying kind things, through being there when they're needed, through trying to understand the child's perspective, and so on and so forth. I want you to keep in mind while I'm going over the different parenting styles that style is a custom complex, meaning that what is typical for a specific culture is going to vary widely. So, you might see parenting norms in one country that seem very outrageous to you. But in order to fully understand why a parent parents that way and what the kind of underlying causes are, we need to look specifically at that custom complex. What are the rules, the expectations, the values in your specific culture that have determined how your own parent chose to parent you? Now I want to break parenting styles down into the four most common categories. The first one is what we call authoritative parents. Authoritative parents tend to be high in acceptance and have higher demands. So these parents will accept their child and view their child as their own person, capable of making their own decisions and determining their own outcomes. However, authoritative parents also make and enforce rules. The key here tends to be that even though they make rules and enforce them, the child has a say in what's going on. They ask their child's input, and when a rule is broken, they'll ask why, to try to understand why the child chose to break a rule rather than just punishing them. However, they will enforce and punish when need be. The key again is to include the child in the decision-making process, and then of course, to show lots of expression of love. On the other hand, you have authoritarian parents. Go ahead and note that these two are easily confused because they do sound very similar. That's one of the study tips that I like to give: authoritative and authoritarian. Authoritarian parents I like to think as tyrants, tyrant. Authoritarian parents tend to not accept their child as being their own person. They make the rules because they're the parent. However, they do tend to be very involved in all aspects of their child's life. So I want you to think back to our two domains here: demandingness and responsiveness. Authoritative parents are high in both. They are demanding, but they are also very responsive. Authoritarian parents, on the other hand, tend to not be as responsive, but show high degrees of demandingness. Our next category shows low degrees of demandingness, but high acceptance and emotional connection with the child. We call this a permissive parent. They accept the child as their own person, just like an authoritative parent, but they tend to leave the child to their own devices. There's not much rule setting and rule following here. The child is kind of viewed as can do no wrong, or it's not really the parent's job to make the child behave well, but I'm still going to love the child unconditionally. On the other hand, we have disengaged parents. Disengaged parents tend to not accept their child as their own and not be involved in the child's life. You can think of disengaged parents as bordering on neglectful, and sometimes we refer to it that way, where the parent is just uninvolved. They're never there. They don't set rules. They don't enforce rules. They don't check in. The child's just kind of left to their own devices. So I want to look specifically at the outcomes of these different parenting styles during adolescence and emerging adulthood. We know that children of authoritative parents tend to have the best outcomes across the board. They tend to be more independent and self-confident, show higher levels of creativity, be more socially skilled, perform better at school, have better friendships and relationships with peers. And they also tend to be good self-regulators, less dependent on other people to help them accomplish goals, help them get their work done, help them make decisions. And an interesting outcome, they also tend to show higher levels of optimism. One of the key outcomes of authoritative parenting is higher levels of autonomy. I want you to think back to what we talked about in the beginning of the semester when it comes to the goals of being an adolescent and emerging adult. One of the key changes we see happening during this transitional period is an increase in the need for autonomy, to be independent and self-sufficient and to think for oneself. This plays a key role in helping an adolescent and an emerging adult navigate this transition. And we do see higher levels of autonomy in children of authoritative parents. Looking specifically at authoritarian parents, children of these parents tend to be more dependent, more passive, kind of lower in autonomy, less involved in their own decision making. They tend to be more conforming to peer pressure, to pressure from parents, to social norms and things along that line. They also tend to be less self-confident, less creative, and less socially skilled. In terms of permissive parents, these children, as you might imagine, tend to be more immature and irresponsible and show higher levels of conforming, whereas children of disengaged parents tend to have some higher levels of issues like impulsivity, delinquent behavior, sexual behaviors, and even drug and alcohol use. So, again, in terms of parenting style, authoritative parenting tends to have the most positive outcomes during this developmental period and long term. One thing I want to note, however, is that it's not entirely up to the parent to determine the parenting style. It's not the case where you take a teenager and you put them with a specific style of parenting, and that's going to produce all of the outcomes we just talked about. Teenagers actually play a pretty big role in determining what style parenting their parents choose. Now, I do want to point out that it's not the case that all children of neglectful parents are responsible at all. That is in no way what I mean. What I do want to suggest here is that parents, teenagers, and parenting style do tend to have a more reciprocal effect, where the parenting's style or the parent's style impacts the teenager, and the teenager also then impacts the parenting style. Basically, all I mean here is that parents are going to notice how their child responds to the style that they're using and make adjustments based off the needs and goals. So, if you have a difficult teenager, that might promote a more authoritative parenting style because the parent feels like that's what they need to do in order to help the child reach their potential. I want you to imagine a teenager who never follows the rules, who talks back all the time, who, when threatened with punishment, just leaves and is very belligerent. Most parents are going to adopt an authoritative style there. Whereas if you have a mild-tempered teenager, it might be more easy to become permissive because you feel like you need to be less or don't need to be as involved in your child's life. However, regardless of the reciprocal effect here, the outcomes that we discuss do still tend to be true. Another aspect of parenting, looking at siblings specifically, is something called differential parenting, where, yes, it is possible that parents have different parenting styles for each child. But we also know that even if the parents are parenting in the exact same way for each child, that style might be perceived differently by each sibling. So, the overall takeaway here, teenagers do play a role in the type of parenting being used and how they perceive it themselves. The next topic we want to look at is attachment. Think back to earlier classes you've taken in psychology and attachment style. Hopefully you remember secure attachment and the different aspects of insecure attachment. To refresh your memory, our attachment style is our working model for relationships, how we learn to expect relationships to go. attachment style is heavily based on the first year of life, where we learn what we can expect from our caregivers. We tend to carry that with us while we form other relationships later on in life. And although it can change, it does tend to be relatively stable, especially when it comes to our kind of default way of approaching a relationship. We know that attachment security is heavily related to relatedness or feeling close to another person, and autonomy, that goal of adolescence, capable of being self-directed. In fact, we know that having a secure attachment style promotes autonomy. And a big part of that comes from feelings of relatedness. So feeling connected and close to your parents can actually cause you to have higher levels of autonomy. This is one reason that authoritative parenting promotes the development of autonomy, because you see that high degree of feeling close or relatedness. We know that teens who are securely attached to their parent tend to have higher self-esteem and overall psychological and, interestingly enough, physical health. I want to point out here that psychological and physical health are very interconnected. In order to improve your psychological health, you should improve your physical health and vice versa. So it's good that we're seeing both of those increase with attachment security. But they also, and this gets at the continuity of attachment throughout the lifespan, tend to have closer relationships with both friends and romantic partners. During emerging adulthood, going a little farther along with our developmental periods here, adults who are securely attached to their parent tend to see higher educational and job attainment, fewer psychological problems, continuing that line of better romantic relationships, and then a kind of a strange random one, less drug use. So, even though attachment forms much earlier in development, during this transitional period, having a secure attachment, specifically with your parents, can be very beneficial and very protective. That being said, regardless of your attachment style, your relationship with your parent, all teenagers, for the most part, are going to experience conflict with their parents during their teenage and emerging adult years. That being said, and even though we tend to think of teenagers hating their parents almost, most teenagers, the vast majority of them, report overall liking their parents and trusting them to be there for them and to give them good advice. Most teenagers even report admiring and respecting their parents and sharing their views on life. So, even though we do see, as we're going to discuss in a second, an increase in conflict during teenage years, I want you to keep in mind that that doesn't mean that kids in this age range don't like and respect their parents. In fact, most of the disagreements that teenagers report having with their parents involve very minor issues, like not wanting to follow curfew, or wanting to dress differently than their parents want to, and even grooming behaviors like piercings, tattoos, hairstyles, and things along those lines. So it's important to remember that for most people, the things we're arguing about do not impact our overall positive feelings towards our parents. That being said, we do know that especially early on in adolescence, around ages 10 to 12 to 13, we do see a very sharp increase in conflict between parents and children. But this does tend to decline by the end of this developmental period. Across the board, adolescents, or 40% of adolescents, report arguing at least once a week with their parents. So very common. This is actually a higher rate of disagreement between what we're describing a normal, or how we're describing a normal parent-child relationship, than an unhappy married couple. So a very high degree of conflict. But again, tends to be about pretty minor things, like me not liking the scarf my mom's wearing in this picture. Because of this increase in conflict, parents do tend to view adolescence as the most challenging developmental period. A big part of that, I think, comes from worrying, though, where we're going to talk about why argument and conflict increases on the next slide. And you'll see, if you can imagine yourself being a parent, some of you might already be a parent to an adolescent, you're going to understand why this is such a challenging time for parents. So, We talked about the areas where conflict tends to increase and described them as pretty mild. These aren't really things that people would assume we would get very upset about. So why is conflict so common? One part of this comes from an increase in physical size. We're no longer children. It's a lot harder for parents to actually enforce rules. They can't pick us up off the ground and move us anymore. So they tend to have a little less control. We also see, of course, adolescents reaching sexual maturity. And with that does come a lot of worry from parents. Worry about what their child is doing, worrying that their child is in a dangerous situation, and so on and so forth. We also see an increase in cognitive abilities, which we've already discussed, where teenagers are no longer kind of blindly following their parents' guidance. They're thinking for themselves. So you might have a conflict that goes like this. Teenager comes home from school, asks their parent if they can go on a date. That date involves getting in the car with their date, going out to dinner, and coming back later at night. The parent says no. The child thinks the parent is saying no because they want to control them, because they just don't understand. But in fact, the parent might be worrying about a much bigger issue, like risky sex behaviors. We also tend to see differences in the perception of the world. We've talked a lot about adolescent cognition. Adolescents tend to see things very black and white, with not a lot of mid-ground. They also tend to engage in that cognitive bias where they think that they are invincible, that nothing bad can happen to them. And that can be very difficult for an adult to understand and a scary experience for a parent. So we tend to see what we describe as an authority versus personal choice issue, where the parent is concerned about the child's overall safety, and the child is perceiving it as the parent trying to encroach on their personal choice and their autonomy. So the big takeaway here, parental conflict during adolescence often happens because parents are trying to enforce rules to protect from bigger issues, while the teenager tends to see it as being an encroachment on their freedom. Let's look next at how this changes during the emerging adult years. We know that most adolescents in America tend to leave home around age 18 or 19, either to go to college, to cohabitate or live with a partner, or to seek more independence, financial independence, social independence, so on and so forth. So in our culture, across the board, most adolescents leave home when they reach emerging adulthood. We know that for parents, there's actually some benefits here. We see an improvement in that parent aspect of the family system in terms of marital satisfaction. We also see a benefit to the parent-child relationship, where we're moving away from that period of intense conflict and seeing children, or emerging adults in this case, developing a greater appreciation for their parents. We'll see people reporting feeling more fondly towards their parents because we tend to view people we don't live with more fondly. So this can be a nice break, a way for that relationship to kind of recover after the intense conflict during adolescence. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of parenting is returning to the nest. As you probably know, it's becoming increasingly common for emerging adults to move back home, either for a long-term or short-term period. In fact, we know that about a fourth of adults will stay at home during emergent adulthood, where they don't leave to go to college or cohabitate. They live at home during their emerging adult years. This is, of course, more common in minority cultures and tends to be because of that emphasis we see on closeness and family interdependence. We also know that about 40% of Americans do return to the nest or move back in with their parents at least once. Typically, this is for financial reasons or to kind of bridge the transition between college and starting your career. This also tends to be more common in emerging adults who marry and then shortly thereafter get divorced. And the big thing we know is that moving back home can be good or bad. There's no hard, fast rule here. For some parent-child relationships, moving back home is beneficial. For some, we see increase in conflict again. What we do tend to see here, however, is that parent-child relationships when a child moves back home, where the child maintains freedom, maintains alone time, where everyone's not spending all of their time together, tend to be better. So if you are in a situation where you're moving back in with your parent, or your child is moving back in with you, it tends to be a good idea to make sure you're allowing for the same degree of independence, or as much as possible, that they had prior to returning to the nest. Our last lecture for Chapter 7 will look at divorce and remarriage.